Hello, everyone, and welcome to our very special author panel. It's an introduction to an end of troubles, a cover reveal and author panel. I actually posted the cover last week in a blog post, so many of you have probably already seen it. Um, I'll show it to all of you here in a little bit in case you haven't seen it. Um, Sorry, I'm just getting a notification. Zoom is requesting to record their computer. In any case, welcome. We're very glad to have you. I'm very glad to have all of these amazing authors with us. We have 8 of our 10 authors live. I also pre-recorded some interviews with 2 authors, Harrison Voss and Harrison Hurst, and I will share a recording from my interview with them later on in the event. For this event, I have all of our authors on screen. They're pinned to this, they're spotlighted to the screen. You as an attendee can have your camera on or off. It's totally up to you. I have set the settings so that your mic remains muted, and I'll keep it that way. Just makes it easier for me to facilitate things. However, I would love for you to say hello in the chat. So please say hello in the chat. Let us know where you're joining us from. Maybe if you know one of the authors, let us know which author you are familiar with. That would be great. So please say hello in the chat. So I've never done a panel of this size. I'm just going to go around and ask each one of our authors to tell us about their work. And I will also, I invite you to ask questions as well. So if you have a question, go ahead and post that in the chat, and I will try to monitor that as well. Just some updates about the actual anthology. So this started as a short story contest in June of last year. It was quite a bit of work to organize the contest itself, as I had to get volunteer judges together, and then I had to make announcements about the contest, and we had quite a few submissions throughout the summer. We had 126 submissions. Each one of the submissions required an evaluation, because that's what I promised, was that the authors would get feedback on their work, and each submission received 2 evaluations. So we had to put together 252 evaluations for the 126 stories. And then we had to go through, my team and I, and read each story and look at the evaluations and decide which ones we thought best represented historical fiction, storytelling, all those sorts of things. And ultimately, we came down with 10 authors, 8 of them that you see here today, that were selected to be published in an anthology. And then in order to publish the anthology, I had to coordinate with each one of the authors, get their bios, get their stories, all those sorts of things, put that together into a document. And then I had to send that out to the designers and get that designed. And next step in the process is to send it to the distributor. So where I'm at right now is it's in the final stages of design. The front cover is designed. I'm working on finalizing the back cover. And then the interior layout has been designed. We just had a few final edits to that. So hopefully by the end of this week, I'll have those things finalized, and I'll be able to upload that to our distributor, who will then send it to Amazon. So if you have not pre-ordered a copy yet, it will be available on Amazon soon, but it will still need just a couple of weeks. The official release date is March 1st. And History Through Fiction is selling it exclusively right now for pre-order in our online store. So I'm going to post the link to our online store, where you can buy it direct from History Through Fiction, and I will send that out, United States Postal Service. If you're international, unfortunately, I don't have the ability to send international, but you can pre-order the ebook. It will be available in ebook as well. Okay, so thank you for bearing with me through all those updates and announcements. Let me share my screen real quick just to show you the cover in case you haven't seen it. So give me just a moment as I do that. So here we have the cover, and this is based off The Winning Story by Hilary Coyne in End of Troubles. And here's the castle and Mary, Queen of Scots, which are part of the story. And it's kind of a torn piece of paper. And anyways, I think it turned out really, really well. And I really can't wait to have the paperback and hold it in my hands. So I think that's great. All right, without further ado, let's talk to some of our authors. Let's start with Janine. Janine, if you could say hello and tell us a little bit about your story, Mrs. Price.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Janine Boulet. I am a writer in Massachusetts. Mrs. Price, the character of from the title is Shirley Price, and she is a young wife in Depression era New York. And she and her husband find that it's very difficult to get work for a married woman in New York. They really are privileging the working opportunities to men first, and single women after that. And so they fake a separation. And through that, she does find work in a factory in New York, and ultimately joins the union. And through her involvement in the union, becomes involved in a groundbreaking musical that took place at the time called Pins and Needles. And it was groundbreaking because all of the actors were union members, so women that were working in the factories. And they were, it was a smash hit in New York City, and it had a rotating cast with real garment workers. And then the story kind of continues along her path, what kind of self-discoveries come along with being involved in that musical and in the union, and what ultimately happens with the marriage through that fake separation.
Thank you, Janine. Sierra, if you could say hello and tell us a little bit about Liberty Coaster.
Right, yeah, sure. So I'm originally from Northern Idaho, but my family roots are in the Midwest. And the idea for Liberty Coaster came about because I went to visit the house that had been built by my great great grandparents, in which my grandfather was born in 1918. And as is so often the case with these things, I came to the idea too late because my grandparents had already passed away. But I was really fascinated by this idea of what it was like to live in Richland Center, Wisconsin during the Depression when they grew up. And so I sort of decided to basically explore that situation, that place and time, through the eyes of a fictional character, obviously, but drawing on quite a few bits of family history. So essentially, Amos, the main character, is a boy whose father has died under unfortunate circumstances. His family has sort of come down in the world, as the community has in general. And it sort of captures an encounter between him and a man in the community who is also struggling. This is also set during the Depression, as Janine's story is. So yeah, it's just kind of, it's almost a vignette. It sort of captures a moment in the lives of these two characters from this little town.
Thank you, Sierra. Next, let's welcome Hilary Coyne. Hilary has the title of the anthology, An End of Troubles. If you could tell us a little bit about your story.
Thanks, Colin, and hi everyone. Yeah, so my name's Hilary Coyne. I'm originally from Scotland, although I'm living in England now. And the story is set in the village in central Scotland where I grew up, and it centres around, and my parents still live there, and it centres around a visit by Mary Queen of Scots, the young Mary Queen of Scots, to the village, to the castle that's up the hillside from the village in the 1560s. And this was a moment, she's 21, she's recently widowed, having been very briefly the Queen of France, and she's returned, having lived all her childhood in France, returned to Scotland to take up her throne as Queen of Scotland. And this is a moment where there's everything to play for, I guess, for her. And this felt for me, essentially after this point, everything starts to go wrong in her life. And I was interested both by the connection to my hometown and also this opportunity moment to sort of explore what lay ahead for her, and to do that through she meets a young serving woman, a fictional character working at the castle, and through her discovers about the landscape and the legends of the place, and she starts to see and discuss the sort of foreshadowing of her misfortunes to come, and the death by execution that will eventually befall her about sort of 20 years later at the age of 44.
Thank you, Hilary. Yeah, it's a really lovely story, and why I mean, it really stood out to us, and I really love some of the themes in the story. I'm going to take a pause here to bring on Harrison Hurst. So I'm going to share my screen so I can show his introduction. Oh, hey, so I'm Joe. Let me make sure I selected the sound. Okay, that is selected. Joined by Harrison Hurst, author of The Dog Star. Harrison, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
So why don't you just tell us about the Dog Star and how you came up with the idea for this story?
Yeah, so originally I've been researching a different story. I'd had a concept for a Viking narrative of a type, and as I was doing that, I came across Ibrahim ibn Yaqub's travelogue of his time in Hedeby. And I don't want to spoil the story for people who are going to read it, but there was one line in that travelogue that really struck me, and the rest of the story just kind of spun off from that one piece of description that he had about his time there, in a very short paragraph that he gave to the city. So, yeah. Anyways, it's a fictionalized account of Ibrahim ibn Yaqub, who was a 10th century Sephardic Jewish merchant and explorer. He went through Eastern Europe quite a bit. What kind of sticks out to me is he's the first one to enter the city of Prague into the historical record, which is so fascinating to me that an entire city just kind of enters into history like that. He's the one responsible for it. He's our earliest record that we have of Prague. Um, but yeah, mostly concerns his time in the Norse city of Hedeby in what is today's Schleswig-Holstein. I hope I said that correctly. Which was at the time a fairly large trading port for the Norse tribe that was there. Um, and yeah, it's the story itself is fairly simple. He's a merchant, so he's trying to do some business there. In the course of trying to do business, he agrees to attend um, one of their native festivals they hold in honor of the Dog Star. This is one of the things he mentions in the travel log is that they worship the Dog Star, which is to them the god of prosperity. And yeah, he gets quite literally gets more than he bargained for as he goes through and attends that festival. Um, so yeah, that was kind of the inspiration for the thing.
And Harrison was the runner-up, so that was a really tough choice there. He had a really great story. Uh, Claire, C.T. Bennett, if you could say hello and let us know about your story.
Hi, I'm Claire, and my story is called The Midnight Bells of the Abbey. It's set in sort of like an unnamed medieval country, and deals with a princess who is promised in marriage to this tyrannical king, and essentially engineers a fake scenario in which she's caught having an affair, so that she can get sent to a convent, so that she can choose the course of her own life. And I found that really interesting to write. It just kind of like showed up in my head, and then I had written it a couple days later, and it just kind of took root, and then there it was.
Thank you, Claire. Next, let's go to Candace. If you could tell us about your story, Those Bereaved.
Those Bereaved is about a young widow in Dakota Territory in the 19th century. And I'm fascinated with the idea of how women survived. Really no opportunities for them to make a living. But anyway, a young widow who's the local midwife offers a cure, and it ends up being a small child that she takes in, and this child has special needs. And I had great fun figuring out how this child would be a cure for this young widow.
Thank you, Candace. Next, let's go to AK. If you could tell us about the Bloodstone of Shiva.
Thanks, Colin. Hello, everyone. I'm Anna McCutcheon. I write as A.K. McCutcheon, and I live in Southern California. This piece is actually the first historical fiction I've written, And although I've been published online in journals, it's also be my first appearance in print. So I'm very excited. So thank you, Colin, and the team at History Through Fiction. I really appreciate the opportunity. The story came about because of a prompt that was given to my writing group, Myths and Legends. And that image kind of popped into my head of one of my favorite vintage action movies, The Mummy, starring Brendan Fraser. And so I ended up with a character of an adventurer circa World War I. The setting is India and England. And the second line kind of tells us where we're headed in this story, where the story within a story, my main character is telling a tale, and he says, I am a murderer. And so the rest of the story unfolds. It is called The Bloodstone of Shiva. And I don't want to give away too much for those who haven't read it, but we find out how my main character, Nigel, becomes acquainted, shall we say, with this bloodstone, tragedies that ensue, and the character arc development that launches him toward until the ending.
Thank you so much. Finally, let's go to Anna. Anna, When Things Collapse.
Hi, everyone. So yes, I'm Anna Day. I'm the author of When Things Collapse, as Colin just mentioned. So for me, like so many of our lovely authors here, I also have quite personal ties to my story. The story is set around the fall of the Soviet Union. And as I am born from Russia and I moved here to California when I was young, at 6 years old. But it's personal in the sense that my family, my grandmother and both my mother and all the other women in my family lived with someone in our family, our grandfather, who was very much an abusive person. And this is something that I see so often within multi-generational women from Eastern Europe, in the sense that they live in a very obviously heavily patriarchal societies where the men are very much in charge, and then they're very much so often isolated. And because my grandmother was never able to escape that cycle of abuse, in the end, it kind of led to her really young death, and very unfortunately, which I still thought about for so many years growing up. And I wrote the story out of inspiration of what were to happen if my grandmother and my mother were able to break that cycle much earlier on in their lives, if they were able to get out. So that's kind of the foundation of the story. Instead of them staying where they are propelled to leave the cycle of abuse based on the backdrop of everything going on in the Soviet Union. It almost served as the catalyst for them to get out of there, to find their own identities, and to shape in some way a much more hopeful narrative for the two of them, while exploring all the cycles of abuse that women go through and creating a new environment where they can find new identities and prosper.
Thank you, Anna. I think you bring up a lot of really valuable points about how these stories can be personal and just so relevant, which is why at History Through Fiction we think historical fiction history is so valuable, because of everything it teaches us and helps us as we try to move forward and have better lives for everyone. So thank you for sharing that history and your story and being able to talk about it. One author is actually we are missing is Anne Wicklinski. She wrote Water Babies, and that's a young girl's sorrow over losing a foster baby.
Oh, sorry to interrupt. I think Anne is waving.
She's here. Okay.
Audience.
She's just listed as AC. Okay, let me bring her on. Okay, I'm sorry about that, Anne. Let me see if I can unmute you.
There, we did it, right?
Okay, awesome.
I was sneaking in as audience because I was late and my computer glitches, and here I am on the panel.
Well, welcome. Why don't you tell us about your story?
Why don't you just kick me out if you're not hearing this, because
I think it's coming through just fine.
okay. I live in rural Pennsylvania, which is why I have concerns about my Zoom. My story, Water Babies, like Sierra's, I was biting my tongue the whole time. Came from a fragment of family history, tiny little seed that didn't seem important to me at the time. But I remember as a kid asking my mother Do you remember when World War II started? What was World War II like? And my mother was born in 1930. And she said she remembers the broadcasts on the radio because she was sitting in the pantry cutting her hair. So that's the fragment that's true in my story. And at the time, I thought it was hilarious because my mother, the authority figure, was being bad. And I loved the story until recently. And again, it was like, you know, a local writing project. This has never been published before, but it was a local writing contest. And I started thinking about this. And it occurred to me, all of a sudden, it hit me like what the atmosphere in that house, which I know well because my grandparents lived and died in that same house, and I visited that house often. I know where the pantry is. What the atmosphere in the house was that like that day when my very strict grandmother, who cared about being a poor immigrant, cared about appearances, the appearance of her daughter. Why was this allowed to happen on that day? Okay, and that's what started me thinking about this story. Where were the parents? What were they thinking when my mother was being a naughty, you know, 9-year-old or whatever she was? And that atmosphere, and all of a sudden I saw my grandparents in a new way. Like, and my mother did have an older brother who could have been, you know, conscripted. So that's where this whole story came from. And there was another slight mention once in my mother's life about a baby coming to the house briefly, and my mother being even younger than this, you know, maybe a 5-year-old, and being confused by the fact there's a baby who's here, there's a baby that's gone, and people are not talking about why it's in their house for a week. So that's where the story came from. And again, like Sierra, I don't have these people around anymore to ask questions of, so it turned into fiction. So,
Well, congratulations. It's really nicely done, and you really capture the perspective of a child very well. Well, I do have one more author here, Harrison Voss. So let me share my screen and share my interview with him. I love this story, which is why it was selected among the winners of the short story contest, and it's in this anthology. If you could just give us a little context for it, I'm particularly interested in the sacred military unit that it's centered upon.
Sure. So Beneath Hades Halls is set in the first quarter of the 4th century BC. And it follows the story of a young soldier named Cadmus, who is one of 300 soldiers of the elite Sacred Band of Thebes. And so the Sacred Band of Thebes was unique in that it is one of the few armies in ancient Greece that was what we would kind of see as professionalized. So it was fully supported by the state, by taxes, basically Cadmus and all the other members of the band. All they did was, you know, be soldiers. And it was also unique in that it was one of 2 recorded armies that was made up entirely of same-sex couples. So the story follows Cadmus and his lover, Demetrius, who fight side by side in battle. And the idea was that if you're fighting next to the person that you love, that you're going to want to fight that much harder, not necessarily to protect them, but in order to impress them. So if you can kill more of the enemy, that'll make you look, you know, that much cooler to your boyfriend, pretty much.
And what were the results? I mean, were they satisfied with, did they get the results that they were looking for by putting lovers together in the same military unit?
They did. For a period of about 10 years, Thebes was able to really dominate ancient Greece. So this story in particular is set on the backdrop of the Battle of Leuctra, which was not the first battle that Thebes had against Sparta, but the first really consequential battle that they had against Sparta, which at the time was the superpower of Greece. And you know, not to give any spoilers, but the Sacred Band does they show up against the you know, invincible Spartan warrior that you know, had dominated Greece for so long.
Okay, yeah, so that was Harrison Voss, and he wrote Beneath Hades' Halls. So I've got plenty more discussion here for us. If anyone in the audience has a question for any one of our panelists, please post that in the chat, and I'll try to facilitate that and get to some of those questions. In the meantime, I'm just going to try to facilitate some conversation here. So first question I have, I'm going to start with Candace. Candace, I'm asking you this question because I know you write novels. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the difference in craft between crafting a story and crafting a novel. And they're both historical fiction, but there's got to be a few different elements to it. Can you talk a little bit about that? And once Candace is done, if anyone else wants to hop onto that, please feel free.
Well, one of my big pet peeves is a slip in research where suddenly a character is given modern language, modern mores. That's my personal pet peeve. And so when I do my historical novels, and I'm just finishing my 8th historical novel, I like to do a lot of research about the history, but also about the language, the music, the terms that people were dealing with. And I think that adds a whole nother level of interest. Like I was finishing up my current project about homesteaders in Dakota Territory. And I stumbled across the fact that North Dakota came into the Union as the first dry state of Prohibition. And that would have been in November 1889. Well, when I realized that, I could not have my characters sitting in the tavern in 1890. I could not have my characters oblivious to the fact that huge changes were happening where they lived. And so I had to move my story up a year and have that being as kind of a backdrop, this discussion about, do we want prohibition? Who wants it? Why are we getting it? And that brought in the bigger world. So to me, to have the story of the people, because people never change, it's just the situation, and then bring in the history and then the greater world. And to me, I think that is what makes historical fiction work. Does that answer your question, Colin?
Yeah, definitely a lot of layers to it.
Yes. Just like one of those Russian nesting dolls, the story within the story within the story.
I wonder if, Janine, I read in your bio about all your years of teaching. I know several of you on here are teachers. Talk about separating yourself between teaching and writing and how your teaching maybe contributes to your work as a writer.
Well, separating yourself is, it's I think the juggling act. I think anyone that is doing something that's intense and working with people during the day, right, and trying to find the time really to put your energy into these fictional people that you're trying to create outside of that. But I think, in terms of, I mean, I was an English teacher. I always said I'd be a social studies or history teacher as my second choice. So the research and the joy in the research when it comes to writing historical fiction, I think really aligns for anyone that's an educator in that way. And then, I find that working with so many different people, young people, but also adults, when you're especially at like the secondary level where I've spent so much time, you're not in a field that you have a common field in that you're in education, but you have all of these different content areas and all these different perspectives of people around you, right? Like I would never, and if I was a grant writer, be having a lot of conversations with someone who's whose passion is calculus. And so there's just a lot of different perspectives. And then the same goes for working with so many young people, so many different perspectives. And so I think it helps with informing the way that your characters develop, because I've just been around so many different types of people and teaching in the city, so many different, so many diverse perspectives. And so that kind of all informs the characters as they start to live in your mind.
Very well said. Any of our other educators can relate to that at all? Well, let's move to another question. Claire, I wonder if you can talk about the submission process. As I mentioned early on, we had 126 submissions, and the rejection, it ultimately follows. And all of you here wrote great stories that were selected, but you never know when you make that submission. So, Claire, I wonder if you can talk about what that's like to put yourself out there, be vulnerable, and accept rejection, or be thrilled with being accepted.
Yeah, so this was actually, I think, my third try submitting to something. I did it actually on a whim. Um, it was just over the summer, and I had some extra time, so I was looking into different publications, and I saw this one. And I submitted it, and I remember I told my mom, and I was like, I definitely won't get in, but it's, it's still experience, and I get to, experience what it's like to have a rejection. And so I've been continuing to submit, and it's kind of insane to me that I this early on in my life and in my publication journey was able to get published, which I think is really cool. And I actually, ironically, I think have received more scholarship rejections at this point because I'm a college student, so I'm just like nonstop applying to scholarships. So I feel like I've gotten really good at projections with all of the scholarships.
I wonder, can anyone else speak to that? Maybe having some early success, but then going through unexpected rejections. Like, how do you persevere through all that?
Can I say something?
Yeah,
Because
please.
I've had my acceptances, which thrilled me. My first story ever, I was pushing 50, and I'm driving 4 kids in a car, and they're all screaming, and I hear a contest for my local radio, my public radio, and I say, I'm going to do this. This is a sign I should write. Never intended to write because I was an English major, and I knew what really great writers looked like, and I was not that. So I entered, I won, got the biggest prize I've ever gotten since. But since then, what I love is the stories that are rejected once or twice, and you get them back and you get to improve them. I love reworking stories. So every story, I still have hope they will find homes, but I just, I'm older and mellow. I'll put more time into it. If I love that story, I believe in that story, I get another chance at it, which I like. Once it's published, you don't get another chance at it. So
Well, that's a great outlook. Just out of curiosity, have any of you had stories in an anthology before?
I did.
Okay, so several of you. Sierra, I wonder if your story you had talked about, it includes an older gentleman and a young child, and there's a lot of subtlety going on with the story. Can you talk about your sort of slower pace and what that's able to convey to the reader? I'm also curious, where does that story take place? Is it in Minnesota?
Yes,
Okay, because I recognize like Hiawatha and some place names.
Minnehaha, yeah.
Minnehaha.
So I actually went to Carleton College in Minnesota. So my family background is from the Midwest, and I spent 4 years living there. And having now spent over 15 years living on the other side of the pond, just writing about that area was really fun because it gave me a chance to sort of explore my roots a little bit. But in terms of the slower pace and kind of withholding some of the contextual information, I think that came about because if you do any kind of writing course, it's drilled into you, show, don't tell. And also circling back to the question you asked, Candace, in terms of writing longer pieces versus writing a short story, you have so little space to try and create that atmosphere and to try and bring in some of that historical detail that's so important. And so you kind of have to use a form of shorthand. So I spend a lot of time mentioning different objects that were particular to the period, and using that as a way to gesture to what was going on in that period of history. So I think, yeah, I think that sort of letting out the information in drips and drabs and letting it sort of accumulate so that by the end of the piece you have a better sense of the era and of the characters. That was what I was going for, and hopefully I got at least partway there.
I live at 44th and Nicollet in South Minneapolis. I'm about 8 blocks. Sorry, everyone kind of froze there for a minute. I have a question from Christy. Shoot. Can everyone still hear me?
Yes.
Yes, hear you.
No, maybe not anymore.
Okay, I apologize. Everyone froze. It said my internet connection is unstable, so hopefully we're past that and it works all right. I have a question from the audience that was directed to me, so maybe everyone can't see it. I want to get to that question. Before I do, I want to bring A.K. McCutcheon back in and talk about, you have a bit of a mystery in your historical story. Can you talk about how you combine the historical elements with the mystery elements in your story?
Yes, when I was searching for a setting for my adventure after I landed on the circa World War I timeline, I came across the troubled history of British colonialism in India, and specifically the massacre at Amritsar. And my story is a mystery. It's not a spoiler to reveal that the character is actually there on that day of this horrendous occurrence, and it very much influences his character development, his character arc, and his mission toward atonement and redemption. At the onset of World War I, India was very much part of colonial Britain. There was governance by the British Raj, which was oppressive and repressive in many ways, with the promise given to the Indian government that there would be more freedoms, certainly by the end of the war. Unfortunately, that did not happen. And this stirred up a very intense movement toward independence on the part of the Indian people, to which the British government responded with even more repressive action. And so in April 1919, which is about 6 months before my story really gets going, a British general, Reginald Dyer, who is named in my story, ordered his troops to fire on a gathering of hundreds of unarmed civilians in an enclosed area where there was only one exit. The British troops, which were Indian troops, ordered to fire on their own people. Hundreds were killed, and this became a huge scar, permanent scar on the relationship, and led to the escalation of Mahatma Gandhi's efforts toward Indian independence, which actually didn't happen until the end of World War II. But for an author, finding this rich history, however horrific, was a great setting for my character, and great texture for the background of my story.
Well, thank you for sharing all that. It shows the depth that goes into writing these stories and the real history behind some of that. So thank you. So the question from our audience member, Christy, was, I'm struggling with my dialogue versus narration of a female character in the late 1800s when a women's role was so restricted. Thoughts? So maybe Candace, anyone can answer, of course, but I know Candace writes in that time period about women. So writing female character with when women's roles were so restricted. Can you talk a little bit about how you handle that?
Well, it depends on where it's placed and what's going on in the world around them. I'm just working right now on a story about a young girl who marries and has to really think about asking her husband about the state of their finances, because she knew that that was not a woman's role to know, and that her mother knew nothing about her father's finances. And so she finally gets the courage to ask, and then her husband was very bristly about it. They did work it out, but I think we want strong women characters, and believe me, women were strong in the 19th century. Their work and their child rearing, their circumstances are amazing. But to show that strength, we have to show it that it is opposite the norm of the time somehow. Like Sierra said, we have to show, not tell. We have to thread it in and somehow get that woman's strength without being out of the times. So.
Yeah, and I suppose it's made all the more difficult the way history has been documented from this patriarchal perspective.
Right.
Hillary, as long as we're on that topic, tell me a little bit about the themes behind your story. What does, and we talked about this on the podcast, an end of troubles, what does that mean?
These are words spoken by Mary Queen of Scots, almost her very last words ever, at her execution in 1587. And it was customary she was beheaded. It was customary to ask the executioners, for the executioner to ask for forgiveness. And she, as was custom, forgave him in advance for what he was about to do, and said that this would bring an end to her troubles. And that sort of was since the story is about foreshadowing her ultimate death, then this seemed a sort of an apt title to me, because she's facing a sort of 19 years in prison, all sorts of plots against her, charges of treason, being moved around different castles in England, not knowing what's going to be happening. Meanwhile, her kingdom of Scotland is being ruled by her son at this stage, but very much in a different way than she might have ruled it herself. So it's and the troubles really. So the themes, as you say, there's as I wrote the story, which started with place, it started as wanting to write about my hometown when I'm living far away, very much evolved into exploring sort of themes of power and agency and influence. And even though she's a queen and arguably has some of those things, she's still a woman in 16th century Britain, and men are holding the power. So all her life, whether it's her husbands, Henry VIII, the King of France, the nobles of Scotland, the different men that surround her, John Knox, who's the sort of figurehead of the Scottish Reformation, they're all seeking to control and influence what she does. And ultimately, back to women, yes, she's documented, but she's documented certainly in contemporary sources by men. And I think there's something about, even with a famous historical figure, there's something about, for me, it was about finding the spaces, the undocumented spaces, and just saying, what if we can just get in there with an interlocutor, an ordinary interlocutor, and what might she be thinking or thinking about? So that was the opportunity for me.
I feel like she had a bit of a calm resolution to her in the story.
Yeah, and everything I've read sort of in some ways backs that up. I mean, she was known to be very playful and loved music and dancing and joyful, but also that she was very strong, very positive, incredibly tolerant, in religious terms. Now, some of that was tactical, but in some ways the results would have been the same had the divisions not been sort of forced through to the same extent by those around her. Yeah, I mean, the more I read about her, the more I liked her, I have to say.
Well, let me bring Anna back in. Anna, your bio says that you are working on a novel. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're working on?
Yeah, so funny enough, When Things Collapse is actually I pulled it from my novel, essentially. It's my novel's title. I basically had to kind of Frankenstein some pieces together from my novel, and I just kind of put it in an interesting format to make it work more as a piece of a short story. And that was a really fun experience because I went through so many parts of my whole story and thought of where I can put each piece to make it feel complete as a short story and have an ending that kind of ends like that ends like, to a way that satisfies the reader, but also is part of a bigger picture as well. And so that's the piece I'm working on right now, as well as, interestingly enough, I'm also thinking of working on a historical fantasy. So I'm always working on multiple projects, typically all the time.
Do you have a working title, or is it going to be the same as the story?
Same as the story.
Okay,
Yeah. Mhm.
nice. Well, we have about 13 minutes here. So again, if any of our audience members have questions, please post those in the chat. I'm going to post a link to the landing page that I put together for the anthology. And if you go there, you can read a short synopsis, a short summary of each story. You can also find a picture and a bio for each one of our contributors, for each one of our authors. So if you go to that landing page that I just posted, you can learn more about the anthology and our authors here. I do have another question for Harrison Hurst. So I'm going to share my screen and share the second question that I asked Harrison Hurst, and he's the author of The Dog Star. Can you tell me about learning about this tradition and what it revealed to you, kind of what was surprising about it to you, and then also how you decided to share that in the story without giving away too much, but how did you really develop that into a story that you thought would be palatable and engaging for readers?
Yeah, and it's I think the story does deal with some dark subject matter, to say the least, and palatability is not always necessarily my concern when dealing with dark subject matter, especially because I do like to write from a historical perspective quite often, and quite often history is fairly unpalatable. But I do think that a story, whenever you deal with dark subject matter, does need to justify itself wherever it's there, and not just be there for sensationalization for titillization. Um, so I think one of the things I just focused on as I was dealing with this is um, okay, this is something that happened in history, not just in Hedeby, but across the world. Why did it happen? What was the thought process behind that? Because I think it's really easy to look at people in the past and, based on their actions, what little comes back to them. Because I think this is an important point. Like I said, this whole story is driven by a single line in Ibn Yaqub's travelogue. He does not go into depth about this practice that I show in the rest of the story. He gives you one line of dialogue saying that this is something that happened. Um, and so, because of that, that's how a lot of things like that come down to us, is we're given very little to work on and to try and fill in the gaps about what was happening and why it happened. Um, and so, part of what I like to do with history is to try and humanize the subjects that I'm dealing with, even the ones who at times do terrible things. Now, humanizing does not mean that you condone, obviously, their actions whatsoever. And I think there are certain lines that people crossed in history that's you start getting to areas of like historical morality. But there are things that even from now you can't just go, well, that was just a product of their time, and they were doing the best they could. Some things go too far for that. But I think it is important to recognize that the people who did this were people like the rest of us, and that's one thing that I want to convey through this story. Because I think it's important to recognize the capacities that we have within ourselves, I think, as people. And that's one thing that you see through history is that people who are not so different from you had the capacity to do terrible things. And sometimes they did it as a matter of course, because that's just what they believed they needed to do, or what was expedient, or what was religion for them, or what have you. They had their different motivations. But that's one of the things I carry with me whenever I write from a historical perspective.
And if it wasn't clear, his story is about human sacrifice, and so it's a very dark subject, but the story handles it in a very thought-provoking manner, I guess I would say. I see a couple questions popped up here in the chat, so let me see if I can get to those. Oh, so Eileen, I guess this is a question for me. Will you be holding another contest this year for another anthology? I plan on it. I will say it's a ton of work and a lot of planning. So I have to have a meeting with my colleague Robin Henry to discuss what it might look like, but I do expect to have another contest this summer. So if you've got more stories, please consider submitting them, and that will probably open up in June. And Prolx, so Candace, oh, this is direct to me, says that we have to look at history in its bloodshot eye. Candace, can you expand on that?
Well, Annie Proulx won the National Book Award, I believe, for the shipping news. And she's an excellent writer from Canada, but lives in the US. And I just love the way she said that we look at history in its bloodshot eye. It's not pretty. And we've all written about things that are difficult. And that's one of the challenges of historical fiction, to be right about these difficult subjects in a way that will not offend, and yet will get the truth of it across. It's a challenge.
Well, or may offend. I mean, you
Or
can't
may
please
offend.
can't please everyone. But yeah, I think all of you, and just in the little discussion we've had, shows that you all are very forthright in what you're doing, and you're all working very hard to get the history right and share these stories the best way you know how. And I think that's all we can do. Janine, I want to ask you a little bit more about your story. So what I love about your story is we start with this couple, this young couple. The gentleman I think he's playing a guitar, and they're so happy. And things kind of fall apart, they change. And so we see this really great character arc for Mrs. Price. And the last line is it really hits home. Talk about how you were able to craft that character arc in such a tight space and the emotion that brings out in the reader.
Well, thank you for that. Part of writing historical fiction that I love is that the history, like the characters find the history as I'm doing the research. And so, for this, right, it was really kind of stumbling upon that musical and knowing that this young woman was kind of in the midst of this self-discovery through being a part of something that was bigger than her and really had women at the forefront. And then alongside that, researching the Depression and the New Deal initiative that the husband becomes involved in, which leads him upstate to be planting trees through the Civilian Conservation Corps. And so it's like that. It's almost as if the research just kind of like brought these characters along, and as I found out more about the time period, I saw them growing apart, which ultimately, that is kind of what happens in the relationship. I was thinking about this, that initial question that you asked too about the short story structure, right? Because you have such little time and the pacing has to be so tight. Most of us are looking at, 5,000 word count limitations. I started to become drawn to like a screenplay writing, like that 8 sequence structure of screenplay writing. So you have, your status quo and your trigger and your quest and your conflict and a little bit of a twist in your resolutions. And so I really have started to use that to plot the character arc and the plot, all the way through, so that I know that I can get there in that short time that's allotted to us when we're writing short stories.
Well, and speaking of rights and women's rights specifically, I mean that was part of what separated them, right? Because she wasn't allowed to work. And can you tell us what that was?
That was really how I came to the whole concept. I was working in, as one of the fellowships that I've been doing, and it was all around New York City history, and coming upon that information that during the Depression, married women really faced that challenge of not being allowed to work, and there was a lot of resentment against married women that wanted to work. I think there was this feeling that they we're kind of taking the work away and taking the money away for some, hobbies versus trying to really provide for their families. And so married women would be turned away. And so that became the impetus for the entire story, is what would happen? What if, I mean, this is a couple that needs to provide for themselves and for their extended family. And she has the ability to do so and isn't allowed to do so. And so that really kind of got it started. And then you enter the whole, the background and the backdrop, I should say, of women's unions and all of the reclaiming of power that kind of happened through that experience for her.
Yeah, it's always interesting when we come across things that weren't even that long ago, and it's just shocking to see what people were up against, and it helps us as we can, try to advance from time periods like that and from rules like that. Well, I don't want to end here without bringing Anne back in. Anne, you had talked about this being kind of a family history, and it allows you to explore that history a little bit more. So, how fulfilling was that for you, and what were you able to learn about your family that you didn't know? Oh,
Sorry, I had to mute it for a bit. What did I learn? It's just as you grow older, all the questions that you wish you had asked. And I lost both my parents within the last 4 years. Grandparents long gone. It makes me dig through boxes of papers and all sorts of artifacts from the family. It's um, made me so much more curious, trying to fill in things. Can I just ask a question of everybody else? The problem I had with, because I am not a historian, and so the difficult for me, I have the family story, and then I have a young character, and one who's ignorant about what's going on in the world. And so many of our characters are not historians. So you want to represent that time period, and yet you don't want them to have our view of what the past was like. You want them to be living in their time period. And I can't wait to read your stories after listening to you today, because how you do that, make a believable character, keep the history real, because my character was wrong about history and what was going on. Like, she did not know. She's a child. So that was really interesting to me. And the other thing it's done is I have several more just little tidbits in my mind of stories I would like to do, and cleave more closely to the history surrounding the characters than I usually do.
yeah, and you bring up a very interesting point about the challenges of, you want the reader to have the information, but the characters might not necessarily have it, and you have to find a subtle way to squeeze it in, show the reader without making it obvious that you're just dumping information on. Does anyone have any comments on how you handle that?
I feel like that's something I'm definitely still working on. Aside from this was actually my first like real foray into like medieval inspired. I am primarily I write books about ancient Greece, and so I'm working on a book about Helen of Troy, and so much of that story is just like everyone knows the story of the Trojan War, and so trying to figure out how do I fit in, you know, because it's a story that we all know, and then there are points that you don't know unless you are really in deep. And then how much does the character know about what's happening? And what does she think about what's happening? And so that's something that I've been really trying to figure out, like how do I walk that line and determine what to include and what not.
Thank you, Claire. Well, we're up against the hour here, so I'm gonna wrap things up. I want to thank all of our panelists. It's actually amazing that we got 8 people together at the same time in the same place. So thank you so much for taking time out of your day. Thank you to everyone who attended. I know all of you have busy lives, and who knows wherever you are in the world what time it might be. So thank you for coming on for this live event. Just a couple reminders. So the anthology is available for pre-order on our website, historythroughfiction.com/store. Those will be shipped out sometime prior to March 1st, so that hopefully you'll receive them by March 1st. I'm finishing up the design. It will be up on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, bookshop.org, various other retailers within, I would say, 3 weeks. And if you want to just subscribe to History Through Fiction, you'll get those updates through our monthly newsletter. But it's a really exciting project. It was a lot of work to put together. And as you've heard from our authors, so much valuable craft of writing, so much valuable craft of history, and so much real, relevant, important history. So thank you to our authors. Thank you to everyone for attending. This has been a blast, and I wish I could talk with all of you more, but it's just great that we're able to come together for this event.
Thank you.
Colin.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.